Good afternoon. A very, very warm welcome to this session of the Edinburgh International Book Festival. Good to see you here in such huge numbers, a tremendous turnout. I'm Brian Taylor. The day job is political editor of the BBC in Scotland. But for August, for a day or so in August, I revert to my first love, which is literature. Actually, it's third after family and Dundee United, but that's not a Dundee supporter in the audience there, is it? Dear, oh dear, oh dear. I thought we'd taken all the names. Great to see you all. So but you get the concept. It's an absolutely huge privilege for me to be here to introduce, as I say, I only do 2 or 3 events. I only do the very best authors, and I'm delighted to introduce one of the very finest writers that Scotland has produced. James Kelman expertly blends thoughtful insight with demotic description. He introduces characters and experiences to us through real-life depiction rather than remote standoff narrative. His writing is, in short, outstanding, not least in his latest volume, that was a Shiver, which is a series of wonderful short stories. In those stories, we encounter people through their experiences, I say. We encounter folk who feel perhaps lost and empty, others who experience anger and frustration, others who experience love and contentment, others who feel disengaged or puzzled or hopeful. In short, humanity. Friends, James Kelman.
Now, instead of reading a short story, I had intended to read a story, but now I think the best thing in a sense is to maybe talk about them. There isn't one story within the collection that might be said to be representative, and also the book doesn't fit my pockets, I suppose. So I always carry a book that fits my pocket too. Anyway, I thought I would maybe talk about stories in general, short stories, because it occurred to me that I began writing them more than 50 years ago. In fact, I had my first collection of stories published in 1973, which is nearly 45 years ago since the first collection. And some of what I experienced as a young writer, I find that things haven't really changed that much, and that my work is still viewed in a certain way, and that here not only in Scotland but throughout Britain and Ireland, we tend to look in stories in particular ways that I don't really. And I was pondering that really, why. And thinking of my own background, my own education, and realising too that I actually left school 56 years ago this month. It seems quite extraordinary, but I actually left school 56 years ago. What does that mean? At the age of 15. And part of why I went in a particular way as a writer of short stories really is because I wasn't subject to higher education, which meant that I could come at literature as a young artist really, rather than through the system. So I had not been taught what to enjoy and what to respect and so on. Instead of that, I was able to choose my own way and go my own way. And as I've said elsewhere, until about the age of 17, I assumed I was going to be a painter. I was very fond of art, visual arts, as I still am. And through my own family, I have a couple of brothers that are here today, and my daughter. But my grandfather was a picture frame and restorer, and as my father was. So in our house, we were used to seeing paintings and pictures and so on. And it was also a house where we had books. Our mother was a great reader. She was always a good painter. My father was a reader, so we always had books in the house. And in a sense, we were brought up to be readers and to be acclimatised to art, is a way of putting it. Because I've had this interest in art, I had particular ways of being interested in literature. And especially also because when I was 15 I went to work in a printers and started at my trade before I was 16 as a compositor. And that meant I became very, very aware of the page as a kind of material thing, in the way you might hear about visual artists talking about paints and their brushes and so on, and how they apply paint. You know, if you think of a painter like maybe Cézanne or something, you become aware how important the actual quality or the substance of paint itself is important. You know, these questions that we are not surprised about in looking at paintings. Or if we think of some of Van Gogh's paintings, for example, we think of like how maybe, you know, the guy with the scythe holding back this extraordinary ocean of a very kind of wrathful corn that's got about to devour him, you know. And when we think of maybe painters like Goya, we think how, you know, that sometimes the horror in these paintings. And we think, where does that come from? In a painting there is no beginning, middle and an end. All you have is this object, this kind of depiction, a kind of a picture is what you have. There isn't anything else except that. It's like a piece of really, maybe a piece of music in that sense, where, not with a lyric, where you have just this piece of music. Now it could be something like say something by Bach, this kind of, this little theme, and it gets attacked and approached in all these different ways. You know, now it's a kind of amalgam of all of that and my own reading, and that was how I viewed what it was I would be doing when I became a writer, or when I started writing, as opposed to just reading. It was like assuming that what I would be doing on the page is really no different from what a painter is doing or a musician, except that my art form is literature, or it's literary art rather than the visual art or to do with music in any way. Now I assumed that, right. And a lot of my early stories are very kind of, I was always very self-conscious about form and content. And the reading that I did also kind of, or the reading, where my reading went. I remember, for example, you know, becoming aware of how maybe Joyce, James Joyce, and writers like maybe Kerouac or something, when I was in my teens, realising the way that they maybe used dialogue. Maybe also because I was an apprentice compositor, but I was very aware of how do they use a colon? Why do they use a dash? What is it that they're trying to achieve with that? And I was also very aware of writers from other cultures. And again, at a young age, really, I started kind of reading Camus when I was about 19 or so, and becoming quite excited about what he was doing. But even before that, I became the writer I kind of read a lot was Zola, Emile Zola. And as I've said before, I came to Zola through my liking for Cézanne, and Zola was, of course, Cézanne's pal when they were young, although they had a feud and so on. But I was very kind of aware of how Zola used language and what he was trying to do in terms of stating what is the case. A kind of a very almost naturalism, a realism that is so kind of materialistic in a sense. I found that very exciting and very political, but I found it very exciting because what it means is that everything is kind of solid. It's very, you don't find a lot of abstract adjectives or adverbs and so on. And the first novel that I wrote, for example, A Chancer, the second published, but the first one I wrote, I was very, very aware now that much of it was kind of inspired by Zola. But the thing, and I forgot about that. One reason I forgot about it was because by the age of 19, I was actually scunnered by Zola. I'd read so much, and I think it was in the middle of one novel. I just gave up and thought, to hell with that. I'm not going back there again, you know. Start to breathe, and I was also reading Balzac, so I was quite happy. And then Stendhal and quite happy to move into these other writers where there was a life, that there was no longer this straight kind of a materialistic sort of thing, you might say. And also I'd been reading other writers, of course. I'd started to read Kafka, I suppose most. That would be in my late teens, and that liking or love of Kafka has never kind of left me at all, really. But there was also within a writer like Kafka was that the dangerous aspect of here as an artist. It wasn't to do with here as a writer for me, it was here as an artist. And I would be very excited to read what was the influences, what was the influences on that artist. You know, that again was another thing. These are they were really central to what it was I was doing, and started again as a young writer. And so even before I had anything published, I was first published in '72. What the hell was that, Brian?
It's a while ago.
Many years ago.
It's the year I left school, so there you are. I tried to work it out from that.
I mean, it's extraordinary. But the other thing that I was doing again because I think again because those of us who don't go through a higher education when we're young, we really do follow and we read. We pay attention to what other writers tell us. And who do they advocate we read? You read people like, for example, Kafka, and you might go, well, you'll go and read Kierkegaard. You go, for Christ, yeah, you've got to go and read Kierkegaard. Oh man, okay, I'll have a go. And you have a go at that, and you do have a go at these different writers. You must read Dostoevsky. And of course, if you read Dostoevsky, I've got to go and read Pushkin now. And then you read Pushkin, you think, well, he was really influenced by Goethe. Oh, well, I like Goethe too. And Goethe, well, now, he was reading Kant, very influenced by Immanuel Kant. Oh no, I've got to go. I'm still reading Kant, and here I'm 71 years of age and thinking, so that's what he was about. It's taken me 50 years to try and kind of get to them. But the thing about it is there is that sense of discovery and excitement and the sorts of things that are applicable to any artist. And it doesn't matter the genre. The one thing again that I did all during these years was to read from other cultures. So I would trawl through the second-hand shops. My pots of gold were always these books that were entitled Great Short Stories of the World, written in many, many languages. That's the kind of thing I would make a beeline for. And start from like, stories from the ancient Hebrew or ancient Egyptian, and go all the way right through to the Tales of Hoffman or something, or whatever it was, all right through, and be very pleased whenever I saw some Scottish writers, and get into, usually you would maybe early stories by, not necessarily early stories, but a couple of the great short stories by probably Scott, Stevenson, rarely James Hogg in anthologies. He's not a writer, in my experience, who was anthologised much, but it was always good to find a Scottish writer in these anthologies. But the most important thing was how it took you into other cultures. And going into other cultures again gives you a different kind of slant on tradition and what's acceptable for writers to be doing. And this again was another thing that was crucial for myself. Writers who were happy to be writers as artists. I remember reading much later on, probably in my 30s or maybe even 40s, becoming interested in Japanese prose. And to read what Japanese prose writers were doing from maybe the 1880s, 1890s, right through to the First World War, that was really exciting and took me right back into the kind of things that interested me in my early 20s, which was the visual aspect. How do you use that? How does a story look on the page? What paragraphing should I use? If it's a first-person narrative, if I'm writing a story from the subjective point of view, how will I use a paragraph? If I'm working a third-party narrative, does that mean I should indent the paragraphs? What happens if I begin one page with dialogue? Will I begin the second page with dialogue? These were things that really interested me and still do. Now, these kind of, essentially, I suppose you would call them aesthetic questions that I was very accustomed to. But by the time I started showing my stories, and the way I'd started to kind of write myself, the stories came out more as standard, as kind of standard third-party narratives, maybe first-person or third-party narratives, but they didn't appear to be anything particularly different about them, except I was trying to chart the individual kind of subjective experience. And I'd got that eventually through, as people, I'm sure others do, your reading starts to go in certain ways. So for me, it started to go Dostoevsky, Camus, Kafka, and so on, Hamsun and people. And you become aware of characters who operate from within the psyche, operate within the dynamic of the subjective experience of one human being. These were the influence. The difficulty for me, of course, was that I came from Glasgow. And as soon as you enter into the experience coming from within our perception, Glasgow, again, like most cities, is a city of immigrants and different cultures and different languages. And our language, the way we use language, or the different ways in which we use language, is really, it was always, even at that time, derided as slang, as whatever it was, dialect, and so on. But what it amounted to was that it was an inferior form of English, a corruption of English, bad English, the language of the gutter, and so on. And of course, when I published my first short story, very, very first one, the printer refused to publish it. The very first story. And I had no idea why that was, what's going on here. Because it had been used to this freedom that other artists use, the freedoms that other writers use from these different cultures. That is what I was used to. I was not used to the authoritarian voice saying, this is how you have to write. You must use standard English literary form. It's not how I had learned and how I kind of taught myself and learned as a young writer. I kind of assumed the freedom just to create stories as best I could, in whichever way was necessary in order to do the story properly. But in doing that, there were various forms of punishment. And even when people were being positive, they always assumed that I was trying to be a social realist or a naturalist. I thought, Christ, I dumped that years ago with Zola. But the best they think I can ever be is this person who is trying to represent so-called working class speech, whatever the hell that might be. I had no idea. It's where I come from, people speak in many languages. Talking one of my brothers here in the audience today, but he was saying to me the other day about a great word, stank. Stank. Now, of course, again, because being a writer myself, I'm very, I concentrate on language, I'm very aware of language. I go, well, that's Norse, of course, like so many of our words here. They're not kind of corruptions, or it's not bad English. Like the word hoose, for example, I would tend to try and spell it H-U-I-S rather than spell it H-O-O-S-E, which makes it a corrupt form of English. No, it's Norse. That's why we call it hoose. There's so much of our language, once you look at it, the old language is either Norse or Gaelic. Of course it's Norse or Gaelic. This is what it is, all these words that we're told, this is bad English. No, Gaelic, or it's Norse. It's like we're charting our different cultures and so on. In other cultures, these things are applauded and they are kind of respected, admired, they're encouraged. Here, no. There is always that thing about class. To use language in this way is always a matter of class. To use language like this is working classness. And of course, part of the problem here in Scotland is that these aspects of being Scottish are actually working class. in the sense that culture at this level is, generally speaking, transmitted through working class people. The old forms of language and these old forms, that's how it comes about. So you're being accused of of not using standard English literary form or being working class. What you're actually doing is using languages in these kind of extraordinary, exciting and rich ways. They're coming down through 1, perhaps even 2.5 or longer 1,000 years. The distinctions between how people here in Edinburgh or in Leith would use language, how people in Dundee would use language, how they would use it in Aberdeen, in Newcastle. What are we talking about there? P-Gaelic. The way people like Irvin Welsh and other younger Scottish writers would use language. You go, hang on a second, that's not Q-Gaelic, that's an older form. Or Aberdeenshire, some of my family are from Aberdeenshire, how they're using language. The Kelmans go back, the Cabrach area, so you go, 5,000 years, okay, go to the other side. The other side is Scotch Gaelic, would be from the islands and so on. So we're talking about how language is used there from maybe south of Shetland, probably Orkney, but going right down to West Cork, where my wife's people come from. And you have all these influences. You have the Norse influence on Gaelic itself. Like in Lewis, when you go to Lewis, it's all these kind of Norse names, but you can go back even further. But these are the kinds of things that as a young writer I was aware of. I was very fortunate in my very early 20s to get John Francis Campbell's, the Tales of the Western Isles, and realising how rich our story culture is. It's just so rich, but it's in Gaelic. And it's mostly an oral form taken down by some great collectors during the 19th century through John Francis Campbell. But these are the influences we have, and these are the influences, these are what I would want to see within the short story form. It really perturbs me to think that the short story is in this kind of, it's almost like it's been Anglo-Americanized out of itself. That's not what the story is, where my own stories are kind of valued or not valued by how they relate or refer to the standard form. My stories were never ever like that in the first place. That is not how I see what prose is. It's not what James Hogg was doing, and at his best it's not what Scott was doing, and never what Stevenson was doing, never mind Grasset Gibbon. We were always doing something other than that. And what we were doing not only ties into that literary tradition, which is a full cultural tradition. And you can see exemplified in 18th century, the 18th century intellectual tradition. I see no difference between what Burns and Ferguson were doing and so on into James Hogg in terms of what was going on in the Scottish philosophical tradition, of the common sense tradition. You always have the struggle between reality and that subjective being coming into it. Yeah. That's always within our tradition. That's what gives the strength to it. It was like the Scottish tradition on people like Descartes and so on, and on Newton going right the way through the 18th century, and you can see it within poetry and within prose fiction. There is nothing kind of mysterious about this, but you have to see it in its proper context. If you don't do that, you will never ever understand how James Hogg managed to write the Confessions. You will never understand that in the sense that ordinary established English literary tradition cannot understand Hogg. It was left to André Gide to discover him 100 years ago or something, and go, who the hell is this? The only way you will understand it is to have some grasp of that Scottish intellectual tradition. Yeah. There is no other way. This is not to do with identity. It makes no difference whether someone comes from Scotland, England, Ireland, Wales, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Trinidad, Jamaica, North America, Canada. It does not matter. But whoever it is has to have some grasp of that intellectual tradition. Otherwise, they will never know what the hell it is we're talking about. Okay, then.
Thank you very much. Tremendous, James. Tremendous. I'll pick up, just because I'm like that, I'm going to pick up a couple of anecdotes that occurred to me as you were making those points. You mentioned Søren Kierkegaard. I was lucky enough to study Kierkegaard for a spell, and I remember being given the book list. The two titles I had to read were Fear and Trembling and The Concept of Dread. So I thought, a lot of laughs then. PG Wodehouse it is not, but you mentioned Dundee dialect. In Dundee, a drain, you call it a stank in Glasgow. In Dundee, a drain is known as a cundy. And it's from French, it's conduit, but it's somehow become known as being a slightly urban, working class word. And my wife and I still remember with tremendous humour seeing this woman in her best Brodie Ferry cut glass accent warning her husband, watch out for that cundy thing. And it was as if she'd said a dangerous word, she was, that cundy thing, it's just a cundy, that's what it is. It's where the water drains away. James, that was tremendous, absolutely marvellous stuff. Let me pick up, I'm going to come to the audience very, very shortly because I want to get you guys involved. But let me come a couple of points from some of the books, in short stories rather, in one called Oh the Days Ahead. There's a conflict going on between this couple, and at one point the phrase is used, if you don't get angry, lie down. Is that your motto to some extent, that you want engaged writing, or is that going a little too narrow perhaps?
In all art, I think, yeah.
You have to be engaged.
It has to be, it's engagement, it's encounter, and it's an active thing, yeah. It cannot, in a sense, art should not be passive. It really, but in some ways the education system, certainly in this country, moves towards that. Yeah. Which is a kind of passive take, which is a kind of medieval really. But so much of what goes on is medieval. What, seeing art as something remote and something remote and distinct to be scrutinised and studied from afar, rather than. Well, you're taught. You're in a sense you're taught the laws of and the principles of something that already exists, and you've not to stray beyond. And you go, well, if that was the case, I would rather just do something else. But if you want to be involved in art, you want to use your own imagination and be as inventive as you can. So you need to find a way out, in a sense, of the academy, in a way, of however the academy comes to you. Just on that same point, another one, one story called Chekhovic's Was Another. It's about a writing group. It's a wonderful story about this writing group, and this guy he's the star of the writing group, and he writes hundreds of stories every week, but of course he drives all the others nuts because they're not producing anything. But there's one line in there, paying too much regard to other people's advice can kill a story. You've just pretty well said that there pretty vigorously as well. Did you get, you must have had a fair bit of advice and maybe tendered some advice down the years, but you're saying just do it your own way. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in tutoring creative writers, creative writing groups since my early 20s really. Since I was about 25 I was teaching creative writing. You must like them. You must like it, or does it? I was always skint, you see. Excellent motivation, yeah. But do you tell your folk you need to write your own way, or do you try and give them? I think an early thing you have to tell people really, or advise people, is never to take it to heart and never alter a story because someone suggests you should. That you really have to wait until you know that's the way ahead, and then you do it. But I would never ever alter anything that someone said unless I kind of accepted it. So you wouldn't say that's wrong. You would never say that, but you might guide them in a different way, or wrong's a dangerous word. Wrong's a dangerous word. Wrong's a value judgment. Yeah. Just another one I'll pick up. I'm going to come out to the audience after this. In the main story, that was a Shiver. Tremendous analysis of class and
class conflicting with the changing society around him. This guy that's been an ex-boxer, and he tries to define himself through that and finds it very hard. He's finding life quite puzzling, and that's an element of many of the stories. Just guys and women that are finding life a bit puzzling. They're finding life a bit challenging. They're finding themselves a bit facing futility and struggle as a consequence.
But it's also, again, most stories I work on really are to try and operate through the inner psyche or dynamic of the individual at the centre of the story.
Yeah.
And for most people, what you said about Kierkegaard applies, because, I mean, I realise that the tradition that my own work would be regarded in, not in Scotland or in England, you know, where it's a naturalist or something like that. But if I go to another country, it would be usually regarded as within the existentialist.
Existentialist, yeah.
So, and in a sense, it's quite clear in the way that my stories operate, simply because it's how we all are as individual, unique human beings trying to make our way in a world and realising that things aren't designed in such a way that we don't have to make decisions every day of the week. It doesn't matter how much information we get. At the end of it, we still have to make a decision.
Yep.
And that is always with us. And when poor old Kierkegaard, well, if I say poor old Kierkegaard, I don't know. But when Kierkegaard...
I don't think he was the cheeriest of guys.
The thing was that he was a very...
But his writing is brilliant.
So, like others, whether it's Descartes or Galileo, the problem is that if you're very religious and what you're engaged in seems to suggest that God is either redundant, irrelevant, or doesn't exist, you're left in a very peculiar position. And with someone like Kierkegaard, it makes the world a very kind of dangerous place.
I've always been influenced by two comments written by French writers. One, when Sartre talked about mauvais foi, bad faith. Yeah. In other words, don't kid yourself on. As you say, you're going to have to take... there's always a choice. Don't kid yourself on there isn't a choice. There's always a choice. It's just not an easy choice, but there's always a choice. But the one phrase that strikes me more is from Voltaire's Candide, where a couple of times the Candide said, nous devons cultiver notre jardin, we should dig our garden. And I don't live by that. That sounds a bit pompous, but I'm struck by that. Don't sit and talk about the theory of gardening. Get out there and do some work. Do the effort. Make an endeavour. Take part. In other words, and both of those writers strike me as...
One of the things on that, when I spoke earlier about the Tales of the Western Highlands, John Francis Campbell's, that tremendous... I think there's 8 volumes of it now. But one of the things I realised later on in the reading was the form that the translation took into English, and it was the storyteller's voice in the oral form. So it's actually kind of consistent with that existentialist view, because usually the story is to do with it's the past present, which is what I like. So, and it goes back to that thing. Is see, on my way to the theatre today, like the way a comedian may begin, or I was walking up the street there, and that becomes part of what goes on in that Gaelic tradition. It's great, He was out sailing, and while I was out sailing, I saw this monster, and I looks up, and the monster comes towards me, and everything is in that, either in that past participle, or it's in the present participle, and it really is that kind of, and that gives it a drama. In its sense, that gives it a kind of, you begin from the drama.
Continuous.
It becomes a wee bit like Kafka, where Kafka uses what in literary terms is called the subjunctive mood. He never leaps ahead of himself. So you're always going, Kelman walked to the door. He hesitated. There was a sound. He might have heard it. He paused. He put his handle on the handle. He opened the door. Ah! Shouted somebody. You never get like somebody who is not Kafka, or somebody from the ordinary English Anglo-American tradition will go, when he got to the door, there was a monster there. Hang on a second. We don't want to have that, as we would say in the old days, the adverbial clause of time. Dump that, because you've ruined the drama. No writer worth their salt ever did that, So imagine a painting, it was going, Picasso, this is a painting of a guy with a pointed hat, with blue and white stripes in his pyjamas. And here's the next painting. No, that's not what happens. You don't get a description in that way. Yeah. What you get is the thing itself And that's what you get in the old storytelling.
The stories are brilliant, James. I mean, they're evocative, but you're evoking people they often have many facets to them. The one I loved as well was the cartwheels of life. The old man reminiscing, and he gets to the point. He's lost his friend Huey. His relationship with his wife is poignant and difficult, but he says there isn't a tomorrow. What you mean by tomorrow? There isn't one, and I really liked that. I was really quite struck by that. Right, I promised to go out to the audience. Let's do exactly that. Let's get some questions and comments, and the hand in the air. The microphone will come your way, sir. Can I see some others as well? There's one right at the back after that. So there, there's hundreds. Okay, there, then here. Thank you. Yes, please, sir.
Thank you. A point of information. First of all, in Leith, the word for stank is Shiver.
Shiver. Oh, right. Shiver.
My question,
what the origin of that be?
James, is that you quoted early influences, and you quoted French and Russian novels, and I wonder, given what you said about the aesthetic and the language, whether translation, how important is translation? Because if you get a bad translation, then you lose some of the idiom and the dynamic, good. The very thing you've just been talking about. And it just seemed a bit strange to me that you were taking your reference from books that you had probably read in translation rather than English language short stories.
Thanks for that, James.
There is an obvious truth in that. One way I would qualify it is by saying that I did read a lot of English work in English language, especially from American literature, and enjoyed much of that. The problem I found with UK literature, again, is to do with it's not even to do with class. It's to do with coming from an area of society that is thought not to exist really, except as kind of ciphers. They don't exist as fully formed human beings. Now, in my case, it really was to do with class, but it also happens with others, whether it's to do with race or ethnicity and so on, and religion, where one of the things you assume when you read a narrative is that the person who wrote the book, it never occurred to them that you might read it. Now, that might happen when you say, for example, Evelyn Waugh, if you happen to be black, African American and Jewish, Waugh would probably have fainted if he'd thought that you might have read his book, because he's basically having a go at you in every paragraph through the so-called God voice. Now, in a sense, the same happens if you're a Glaswegian male from my own culture. In literature, it still applies to some extent. You're always stereotyped in a certain way. Now, so I was kind of used to that because the work I had read from a young person. I mean, when I was a boy, I was very fond of school stories and things like Billy Bunter and Tom Mary and so on. And of course, the class system in those, I had to identify, or I said somewhere recently, I used to like R.M. Ballantyne. Yeah. I read his stories when I was a boy, and I was fond of things like The Coral Sea and Martin Rattler. But the problem was you had to kind of have empathy with young lords from the English upper classes. Now, I never found that a problem. It was easier for me to have empathy with them than it was to have empathy with the servant or the little urchin who climbs the chimneys. So I kind of moved out and moved into the literature from other cultures that I found I could be like a fully realised young adult male within that, and it was assumed that I lived and breathed, and so would my offspring, and so on, and they might make a decision on their own that wasn't dictated to them by authority or something like that. I take the point about translation. There's really not much I can do about it.
I'll spend years. Yeah. Thank you for that. There was a question. Either of those two hands. Take that one there first. That's great. Thank you.
I'm thinking about your first story because it was particularly pertinent, I thought, in terms of what I've just heard you say. In that one, a man starts thinking about all areas being controlled, all areas being barred. The exact quote, the quote is, he says, music is barred in this town, it's only in controlled areas like everything else, subways are for going for work and other places of confinement.
Is that the story back in that town?
No, it's on the days ahead.
Or the days ahead?
And then it immediately works into a conversation where his language is then interpreted as anti-gay or anti-woman or or racist in some way.
Yeah.
And I'd never quite understood what I'm beginning to understand through this story, that in some senses you're saying to what extent language controls is a choice,
yeah,
rather than an imposition. And so it's really a question about language, because I'm also fascinated by that story clinging on.
Thanks.
2 pages that play upon the meaning or no meaning of the word that.
So that was I thought that was brilliant. I agree with that. That was really very striking. And that particular one you mentioned goes through this sort of dissertation on a single phrase, and the last 2 words are, oh God, and you can feel the futility. That one, James.
I think the character at who is central to the story is also someone who's just managing to avoid being bitter, and I think. The woman, I think the woman that he's with describes him, or he describes himself as a failed musician, or he's unwilling to describe himself as a musician, although both he and the woman that he's with knows, well, he plays music and other people think of him as being as a musician. What's wrong with, what is the issue there? But the issue there is just to do with how his self-perception and so on, and it's a kind of difficult story in some ways. Anyway, it's hard to talk about because people here haven't read it.
But they will, because they'll go next door and buy the book and go to the signing. Just take another question from here, and then I think there's a hand raised there. Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Hi, Jim. This is more a request than a question.
Oh gosh.
This time last year in this tent, you gave a hypnotic reading from your novel Dirt Road, and I wondered what it would take to persuade you to give a short reading from either a shorter story from the book, or part of a story just now, just so we can hear you reading from this book.
You know, I'd thought of reading. I just thought it was difficult to do it.
James.
You know?
Which one do you fancy?
I really don't know. I can't. You see, I can never read. It's impossible to give an idea of a story.
Yeah.
It would be the same, it's impossible to do that. So the only thing I could do would be to read an entire story.
Yeah.
I can't do anything other than that. I can't give any sense of a story. Clinging on. I would, clinging on is a story I could read the story. It's a difficult one to...
We find it.
I can have a go at it.
Where is it? Thank you very much. Well done. Just read among yourselves.
I'll just have to say.
There we go, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Right. It occurred to me I was awake.
That's a great bit.
From here was difficult. I had to remind myself that that was absent, and its significance, the absence, or non-existence, or negation, and to piece together or distinguish the several parts. The normal or regular, I speak of the day-to-day, discourse or communication, the sentence would have written as 2-part, comprising 2 clauses. It occurred to me that I was awake. A writer of prose might well have used a that, and therefore lost the meaning for the second clause. That I was awake slips into a past or simply different time zone, whereas a poet might have written or expressed the sentence separated by line spacing. Thus, it occurred to me, I was awake. Finer prose writers are wary of making use of the poet's devices. They do so, but cautiously. What is clearer now is the separation between the two clauses is not just ambiguous, but offers a minimum two meanings. And these may be conjoined principal statements. It occurred to me, and I was awake. And might be expressed or written, it occurred to me, open brackets, I was awake, close brackets. The difficulty is the use of brackets suggesting a banality which amounts not to tautology, but, upon examination of one statement, the other may be found. Not can occur if one is asleep. If the act of occurrence has occurred, then certainly one is awake. Following this, I can express it thus. I was awake. This realization had taken hold of me, and the corollary, that I might be expressed as a sentence. If so, the use of the term might is the key to the evaporation of the space between us, open brackets, me and reality, close brackets. From here it follows that I may or may not be so expressed. I was aware of this. Oh God.
Thank you, James.
I would say that was why I chose not to read a story.
And it was brilliant, it was brilliant.
Apart from one thing, this story reminds me again, this sounds kind of pathetic. It sounds to me yet again of another reprise of Descartes' first meditation.
Oh, yeah.
Which I was doing kind of spoofs of when I was like in my 20s. And now here I'm a sad old bugger still doing it.
Well, it's the best Cartesian short story I've heard anyway. It was actually, and of course I ruined it entirely by giving away the ending. You'll have spotted that, yes? Please, sir, please.
Thanks, James. I've got a question, a technical question as a writer who's tried in the past to write stories in Scots and in accents and so on. My problem was I was living in England at the time, and in my writing group we had this policy that you'd read each other's stories. So I'd write a story, and then you have to give it to somebody else who was from Essex, and it was always painful to listen to. And it was little things that made me think, how important is it? And that's my question really. How important is it to write something in a way that you know the reader is going to be able to hear it in their head? Okay.
Now I should say this to you that in my first collection of stories, again, it came out in. I'd finished by 1972, but I made a kind of leap during the writing to working in a kind of phonetic transcription, and the story began. Strange thing was, it started on a Wednesday. I mean, nothing ever starts on a Wednesday because it's the day afore Pie Day, and I might skint. Sometimes get a pint round the anchor, but that's about it. Now that's the opening lines to a story of mine called "Nice to Be Nice," which I wrote that in about 1971 or something. But it's in a phonetic transcription, and it was before I'd come upon Tom Leonard's work. I hadn't heard of Tom at that time. We didn't meet until about 2 years later. It would have saved me a hell of a lot of time if I'd known Tom's work. I mean, I remember having a big kind of a big argument with a guy that lived up above us in Woodside in Glasgow. And it was all to do with how the hell do you spell Wednesday? And he was a reader as well. This guy Frank McGowan. Frank would go, look, he spelled it with he spelled it Wensday, and it took me a while to come back to him and go, Frank, it's actually a glottal stop. You're right, Wednesday, it's a glottal stop. You know. And it's actually Wednesday, because I want this story to be, although it's written in a phonetic transcription, the guy's talking to somebody in authority. So he'll say, he'll use his glottal stops. He won't go Wednesday. He'll say Wednesday, like that, you know, fucking. Instead of just like, relax, man. You don't have to use an apostrophe at the end of your sentence, you know. But what I would say, I kind of worked eventually into a situation where It was to realise that a phonetic transcription is really not enough. What's most important of all is the syntax. Get that syntax and get the phrasing. That's what you go after. So you have to start to use punctuation in a different way. So it's no longer standard English literary form.
So people will get the word from the context, but perhaps all from the syntax.
The thing is, you have to get the unit of breath. Poets here will be much more aware of what it is I'm talking about here. Get that unit of breath. So what you say, if you look at the lyrics, or you think of maybe Bob Marley, a Bob Marley song, or if you see the lyric there, and just pay attention to the punctuation. There's some prose writers around in the Caribbean at that time. People might know Sam Selvin is an obvious example. Sam Selvin, or think of the Nigerian writer like, well, there's quite a few. Anyway, what you'll get there is the actual phrasing itself is different. Although they seem to be writing in standard English, the actual punctuation's different. So if you read some of mine, you'll get maybe, an obvious example again would be a comma at the end of a sentence with but. The example, you can't do that but. And the but's at the end of the, you know, and there is no comma between it. Now editors right now have a problem when I use language. Even in Canongate, they have a problem there. They have a problem in finding that you're using punctuation for oratorical functions and not just literary functions. But that's where you should get it. So you think of someone like, for example, Samuel Beckett. If you read, I mean, Beckett's a very difficult writer, but if you pay attention to what Beckett, or how Beckett is writing, you go and read something like that extraordinary novel, How It Is, and the only piece of punctuation he uses is paragraphing. There is nothing else. He's such a fine writer of prose that he doesn't even use commas or full stops in this. And yet you will find yourself using language or reading in a kind of upper middle class Dublin type of voice. Bearing in mind that was Beckett's background. It's not like a James Joyce story where you might get ordinary guys in the street. Beckett, it's not something Beckett himself I don't think is really comfortable with, but you'll get a great sense of the kind of Anglo type Irishman as Beckett was, because he's such a fine, he's so precise. But one of the things you'll learn about that and giving to writers from other, or people from other places, all you have to say to them is pay attention to the punctuation. Some of you may know the great French playwright Marguerite Duras, a writer of prose, great French writer from about 40 or 50 years ago. Her instruction, she was a really great writer. If you don't know her, you should go and read her. D-U-R-A-S is her, how you spell her second name. But one of the things that she instructed actors, she said, look, makes me smell, all I want you to do is this: stand up at the damn microphone and read the punctuation properly. Don't do a damn thing. But in a sense, you know, but you take the point, if you can remember the point.
That was great. We've got time for one more, I think, perhaps. There's a hand raised way, way, way at the back there, please. Is there? Yeah. Is there another one, is there? Oh. Very, very briefly, if you would. Yeah, very, very briefly.
Yeah. When I use the Glaswegian but at the end of a sentence, I put a comma and then the word but. Do you think that's an artistic compromise?
Oh yes.
Could you?
when I first moved to live in Glasgow, I was going down the street but, and I was going, but what? You know, and then my Dundonian psyche had adapted to it.
That's the Glaswegian form. But is that an artistic compromise to separate it with a comma at the end of a sentence?
I actually can't pick that up. Can you?
Should you be a comma before the but in the Glaswegian but? Final terminal but.
You really can't compromise at all.
No, exactly. No compromise. No.
You know, there is the serious point about that is, as soon as you enter into negotiation on that point, the character dies. Don't write the story. Go and write another story. Because the character's breath is gone. Really, that's a really serious point.
For the addition
the breath of that character no longer exists.
For the addition of a comma, the character deceased.
Takes one comment.
Last question, way at the back. Yes, please.
Jim, you're an articulate, socially engaged commentator and artist, like hundreds of others in Scotland. But over the last 30 or 40 years, how come your voice has been pretty much missing from the mainstream media, television and radio? Not just your voice, but hundreds of other writers and artists in Scotland are overlooked, marginalised, or even excluded from our mainstream broadcasters. Why is that in Scotland? 'Cause this is not norm for any other country.
I think part of it that's consistent with what I'd said earlier on is that so many of those who are in control don't really understand what the Scottish intellectual tradition is. They don't know what it is. People do their best. I mean, at the risk of being controversial, Scottish National Theatre's like that. I mean, it's like about 70 years out of date. And we go, why does it still think that's what Scottish drama should be? And you know, what's going on? You know, they have a particular view of what it should be, which is a kind of kitchen sink kind of 1950s kind of, I won't mention writers' names, but that type of thing that you go, come on, you know, I mean, you know. But the same thing applies in terms of whether it's prose or poetry. You have I mean, I mentioned Tom Leonard, you know, you think of, how on earth can Tom not be treated properly in his own, here in his own country? Why are proper artists here not, that people don't even know who the hell they are? They don't. You go anywhere in Scotland and no one knows who you are. It's a really weird situation, you know. So I mean, I actually kind of basically agree completely with what you're saying, is that no one, but maybe things are altering a little for the better. I know that they are in terms of the Scottish philosophical tradition. People are beginning to understand that there is a distinctive thing about it. You go, why was someone like Kant, he wasn't influenced by John Locke, he was influenced by David Hume.
Hume, yeah.
What was it about Hume that was different? What was it about Thomas Reid why was Thomas Reid so upset by David Hume? Why were they, what was going on here? Why is about the only person Einstein mentions Clerk Maxwell? What is it about Clerk Maxwell's work that made Einstein say he was the most important thinker since Newton? What made Colin Maclaurin's the great mathematician of the early 17th century, 18th century rather? Why does no one know who we're talking about? I mean, there are all these figures, but you go into, but that takes you into a political issue. I mean, I particularly like, for example, 1819, as we know about the Scottish insurrection, 1819, 1820. Why do we not know about Thomas Chalmers? I mean, here in Edinburgh, you know, and these links in, I mean, it's such a big issue here. A relation of mine was in prison for 6 weeks, 6 weeks in 1888. James Connolly and his big brother went to the trial, you know, to watch him. As Roderick Mackenzie and you know, who was with Donald McRae and the Deer Park Raiders from Lewis, you know. We don't even know about that. I didn't know about that until I was 65. And he's a relation.
James, thanks.
I didn't know about the Scottish insurrection until I was a published author. I knew nothing about Hardy and Baird and James Wilson. I knew nothing about that.
I tell you, I
didn't know that Connolly was Scottish.
The bit I like about Hume is he said, I have made no enemies except all the Whigs, all the Tories and all the Christians. I think kind of a comprehensive view of things. Friends, we're going to have to draw it to a close there. James and I are going to pop next door to the signing tent. I hope you'll join us in large numbers to purchase books and get them signed. But before we do that, would you join me in giving a huge vote of thanks to James